Good morning. Am I on? Hopefully. Okay, cool. This morning I'd like to talk about going home. And I'll make a note before I start. I'll be reading this morning from the English Standard Version. And if anything I say this morning is confusing or you don't agree with or something, make sure to talk to me afterwards and let's talk about that. Have you ever been away from home long enough to have a really, really strong desire to get back? Maybe you've been on vacation for a couple weeks, and as it's coming to an end, you just really want to get home. Or maybe you've been gone, but you really didn't know how much you were missing home until you got back, and then you sat down, and it was like, wow, home feels really good. But what is it about home that you look forward to? I know some of y'all go camping. I don't go camping, but if you go camping, let's say you've gone camping for a week or so, maybe what you look forward to about home is like the structure, the roof, the comfort, all of the solidity of it. Or maybe for those of you who have, let's say you've lost a family member, a parent, or somebody who you really love, maybe you would give so much just to go back one more time, to go home and talk with them. And so that's the relationship that home has. There's both structure and relationship in home. We know that our homes are not perfect in this world. They're not without inconvenience, and they're not without pain. Of course, the physical structures, our houses have issues. We have issues all the time. But the relationships inside have issues as well. So does that ever make you long for more? Maybe for a home with God. At the end of John chapter 13, after Jesus has washed the apostles' feet, and then Judas has gone out to betray him, in John chapter 13, starting in verse 31, it says, when he had gone out, I think that's talking about Judas, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered him, "Where I am going you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Jesus says in verse 33 of John chapter 13, "Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." Jesus was leaving. And how troubling would this have been after spending so much time with Jesus, so many days, weeks, months, years with Jesus in a close company, for him to say that he's going somewhere where they couldn't follow. It would have been so troubling. And so maybe it's fitting in chapter 14 that it starts by saying, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going." Jesus tells them that there are many rooms in his Father's house, and that he's going to prepare them a place, and that if he's doing that he will come back and take them to himself. So let's talk about this home this morning. If you would turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1. Paul says, "For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." The new home with God is eternal. It's going to last forever. Notice the contrast in verse 1 that Paul makes when he says that the tent that is our earthly home And then he says a building from God. He uses that word tent to describe what we have right now, and the building to describe what's coming. And like I talked about going camping, you don't want to live in a tent for the rest of your life. Tents are flimsy. They're not made to last. They're temporary. They're not solid. And so what we have right now is a tent, and what we have coming is a building. It's eternal. It's going to last forever. Paul also says that it's not made with hands. God is its maker. In Hebrews 11, in verse 10, when it's talking about Abraham and Abraham going to a land that he was going to receive as an inheritance, it says in verse 9 of Hebrews 11 that he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. It says, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. This new city, this new home, has foundations, and it's designed and built by God. Notice again the contrast between Abraham's tent and what it says about the city. It has foundations. It's not this temporary dwelling, and it's designed and built by God, so the ESV says. We can be assured that this city with God as its builder will be firmly solid. It has foundations. Also, the quality of the city is implied by its maker. If God is making it, it will be exactly as he has planned. In verse 16 of Hebrews 11, it talks about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others there who, in verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised. Then it says in verse 16, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. God's city is better. It's better than anything Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob left, anything that any of them had experienced. And it's better than anything we have. It's just better. God's city is heavenly. It's not on this earth. Also, God's home is prepared for the faithful. In John chapter 14, Jesus said, in that context we were just in, John 14, in verse 2, if it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Jesus told the apostles that he was going to prepare a place for them. This home that we have with God is prepared for the faithful, and for us, if we are faithful to him. And back in Hebrews chapter 11, right after what I just read in verse 16, it says they desire a better country that is a heavenly one, just like we were talking about. And it says, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. This is prepared for those who follow God, who are interested in this new city. And God wants these people to inhabit the city that he's prepared. He's prepared it for them. And this home is without pain and suffering. In Revelation 21, in verse 3, verse 2, it says, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. This new home with God is without pain and suffering. And so what we talked about home earlier, it's got both structure, it's got a house, but it also has relationship. And this home does as well. You know, it has foundations, it has structure, it's better, it's heavenly, it's eternal. But it's also with Jesus. In John 14, when Jesus is telling them about the home that he is going to prepare, It says, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way where I am going, to where I am going. So if you think about the pain that separation would have caused for the apostles, for Jesus to be leaving them, for them to have spent so much time with him, and for him to talk about leaving and then leaving, how much pain that could have caused. But if we know that Jesus left, Jesus says that he's coming back. We can be assured that he's coming back. And he's coming back so that where he is, they may be also. So let's think about that home where God and Jesus are. It's not just a structure that's great and eternal, but there's also this relationship that we can have with Jesus. So we sing a hymn. There's a habitation, and here's a few verses of it. There's a habitation built by the living God for all of every nation who seek that grand abode. A city with foundations firm as the eternal throne, nor wars nor desolation shall ever move a stone. No night is there, no sorrow, no death, and no decay, no yesterday, no morrow, but one eternal day. O Zion, Zion, I long thy gates to see. O Zion, Zion, when shall I dwell in thee? How does this home affect our perspective in this life? First, we need to live and think like a stranger. This involves looking forward to what is to come eternally and leaving the past behind, leaving what we had behind. In Hebrews 11, talking about Abraham, when he went out, leaving his home, it says he went to live in the land of promise in verse 9 of Hebrews 11, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. And then in verse 10 it says, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations. He was leaving what he had. He's living in the land of promise, and he's looking forward. In verse 13, talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the others there, it says, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. And then in verse 15, it says, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. They weren't looking back at what they had. In verse 16, it says, but as it is, they desire a better country. They're looking forward. And then in verse 26, talking about Moses had so much opportunity in Pharaoh's house. But in verse 26 it says, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. And then in chapter 12, in verse 2, talking about Jesus, it says, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. The joy set before him. He was looking forward to what was to come. And we need to do the same. We can't look back at where we've been and what we've had. We need to look forward. We need to live like a stranger. In Numbers 11, the Israelites, when they were brought out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery, out of bondage, God brought them out of so much. And they're going home. They're going to the promised land. And there was nothing in Egypt that was good. There may have been a few things, but their state in Egypt was terrible. And they were calling out to God for help. And he brings them out and he delivers them with a great hand. And then we read in Numbers 11 in verse 1, and the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. Here they are, of course, complaining in the wilderness. We do that too. But in verse 4, it says, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. God had provided bread in the wilderness for them, and all they can do is look back to Egypt on their slavery and say, oh, if only we were back in Egypt, if only we had the fish that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, all these things that they're looking back on that wasn't reality. Maybe they had food in Egypt, but it came at a great price. It did not cost them nothing. They were in slavery. And so we also, can be tempted to look back at where we've been or what we've given up, instead of looking forward to the home that is to come. In Romans 6 and verse 21, talking about the sin that we had been in, or that the Romans had been in, it says in verse 20 of Romans 6, "For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. But what fruit were you getting at that time from the things of which you are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death." If we ever catch ourselves looking back on what could have been or what we could be doing, instead of pursuing this home, then we've got a huge problem. And the sin that we were brought out of will bring us no lasting joy and no lasting benefit. It's just worthless, just like the slavery in Egypt. So we need to look forward. We also need to watch out and not get too comfortable. In Hebrews 11, in verse 9, talking about Abraham again, when he was called out, in verse 9 it says, "By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise." Abraham did not build a house and get comfortable. In verse 10, it says he was looking forward to the city that has foundations. He was looking forward to a house that was to come, a city that was to come. And he was content, or he lived in a tent. And if you think about the contrast in between that and Lot, in Genesis, let me see. In Genesis 13, Abraham and Lot had lots and lots of blessings, of livestock. And they were getting too big to dwell with each other. There was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. It says in chapter 13. And so Abram says to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me." In verse 8 of chapter 13 of Genesis, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." So Abraham lets Lot make this decision. Where do you want to go? We need to not fight with each other. And so I'll let you choose. You'll choose one way, and I'll go the other. It says in verse 10, "And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley," in verse 11, "and Lot journeyed east." And then it says in verse 12, "Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom." Lot is still living in a tent, but he chooses the direction that he sees that's green and well watered, what looks like a good decision. And he moves his tent as far as Sodom. And then if we fast forward to chapter 19, verse 1, "The two angels came to Sodom in the evening." This is after the angels had come and Abraham had fed them. They go to Sodom, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet." Here we are. Abram and Lot were living close together. They split. Lot goes towards Sodom. He's got his tent. And then here we are in chapter 19, and Lot's in Sodom in a house. And of course, Lot was righteous, and we read about that in the New Testament. But we can see how perhaps this decision seriously affected his family and seriously affected the state of his well-being and his spiritual well-being. It just wasn't a good decision. Move his tent to Sodom and then build a house and live in Sodom. Lot perhaps was too comfortable in this world. And it's not that we need to deprive ourselves or need to do anything crazy, but we just need to not be comfortable, because we're looking forward to a home that's to come. In Proverbs chapter 30, In verse 7, the writer of this chapter says, "Two things I ask of you, deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God." With prosperity comes an opportunity for us to deny the Lord, to be content here, and to not look forward to what is to come. We could read about in Deuteronomy 8, the children of Israel, as Moses is warning them about when they're going to come into the land. And he warns them about when God has given them this home and when they have houses. And it says in verse 11 of Deuteronomy chapter 8, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes." Verse 12, "Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." There's a temptation for us when we're blessed, and we are blessed so much in this life, to forget God and to forget the home that is to come. And we just can't do that. We have to watch for prosperity. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 19, or in verse 17, 1 Timothy 6 and verse 17, Paul says, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy." If we're rich in this world, and many of us are, we have to be careful not to be haughty and not to set our hopes on those things that we have. It's not about what kind of house we have, what kind of opportunities we have, what kind of blessings we have. It's about the home to come, and we have to keep looking forward. And if we think about Moses back when we were talking about him in Hebrews 11, he was growing up in the house of Pharaoh. And there was so much opportunity and riches that were just right at his feet that he could have taken. And he chose not to do that because that was not the direction that God wanted him to go. Also, we need to abstain from the flesh. In 1 Peter chapter 2, in verse 11, Peter says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." As sojourners and exiles, we must abstain from the flesh. This attitude should be very clear in our life. Back in Hebrews 11, talking about those who were seeking a homeland, in verse 14, it says in verse 15, "If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out," verse 13, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." Verse 14, "For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland." These people made it clear. It was obvious from what they said, and probably from their life, that this world was not their home, and that they were seeking something beyond. And this should be clear in our lives as well. Is my life reflecting my position as a pilgrim in this world? If I'm interested in the home beyond, then I'm going to be less interested in pursuing physical success and comfort and prosperity here. And when I do that, people will recognize, it will be obvious in my life that I'm looking for something else. How else does this affect our perspective? Don't worry about your tent. In 2 Corinthians 5, we've been to this passage before. We read verse 1 earlier, or part of it at least. It says, "For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God." If our tent wears out here, we've got a building from God. Don't worry about your tent. If you go camping and it's like your last morning, you wake up, something happens to your tent, gets broken, whatever. It doesn't matter. You're going home. And we can be assured that our tent will last as long as it needs to, and then we can go home. And going home is much better. Don't lose heart and keep courage. here in the same context in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 16. In verse 15, Paul says, "For it is all for your sake, so that his grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God." Verse 16, he says, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen." And then in verse 6 of chapter 5, it says, So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Don't lose heart and keep courage. It's not about the outer self, as Paul says. It's about the inner self. Anything we face here is light. The light momentary affliction he speaks of in verse 17 of chapter 4, and it's compared with the eternal weight of glory. What we have to face here is not anything like the glory that is to come. So don't lose heart and keep courage. And like Jesus said in John chapter 14 to the apostles, let not your hearts be troubled. We have to walk by faith. In Hebrews 11, well, let's stay in 2 Corinthians 5 for now. In verse 7, it says in verse 6, we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. It says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Since this home is eternal, like verse 1 says, if we look at verse 18 of chapter 4, the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. We can't see this home. And just like Abraham, that's, I think, what's referenced in Hebrews 11 here, Abraham's going to a land that he hasn't seen, he doesn't know, and we can't see our home either. And so we have to have faith. We have to trust God that the home that he has prepared, number one, exists, that it's there, and that it's better than anything that we can imagine. And also, we need to groan and long for home. Here in 2 Corinthians 5, in verse 2, it says, for in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Paul groaned. Paul longed for what was to come. In Philippians 1 and verse 23, perhaps a similar passage here. He's talking about whether he's going to leave or whether he's going to stay. And he says, I'm hard pressed between the two. Am I going to leave or am I going to stay? He says, my desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. This is his desire. This is his longing. He says, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. We need to long. We need to groan for home. So do you ever groan for home? Does this world ever beat you down enough where what you would really like to do is just go home? That's a good thing. We should groan for what is to come. Paul wanted to leave and go be with the Lord, and he said, that's better. And this is the attitude that we need to have. So is your perspective in the right place? Are you acting like a stranger? Is it obvious in your life? Are you living this way? Are you speaking this way? That you're going somewhere, and that this world is not where you're going to be comfortable, and this world is not your home? Is this your perspective? I have another hymn that I'd like to share with you. It's called Forever with the Lord. It says, forever with the Lord, amen, so let it be. Life from the dead is in that word, 'tis immortality. My Father's house on high, home of my soul, how near at times to faith's foreseeing eye thy golden gates appear. Ah, then my spirit faints to reach the land I love, the bright inheritance of saints, Jerusalem above. Here in the body pent, absent from him I roam, yet nightly pitch my moving tent, a day's march nearer home. Are we moving closer? Are we pitching our tent closer and closer and closer to this home? To close, let's look at 2 Corinthians 5 again. In this same context, he talks about pleasing God. Verse 9, it says, so whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. Are you pleasing the Father? This home is coming, But not only is this homecoming, but judgment is coming. And that's the deciding factor where we will go. In verse 10, it says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." Judgment is coming. And we must please the Father. This must be our attitude. We must look forward to the home that is to come. So are you pleasing to the Father this morning? Is that your attitude? Are you living this way? If you're not, you need to make some corrections. You need to make a decision to serve him and to follow him. If we can help you this morning, come while we stand and sing.